I'm James Heimowitz, and I'm the president of China Institute. And it's just a delight to welcome all of you. As you're signing in, I think we're expecting more than 300 people this evening. Speaks a lot. It speaks a lot to the importance of everything that we're trying to do. For those of you that are already members of China Institute, a big warm welcome to our members. And if you're not, please remember to go to our website and to sign up, because so much of our funding and support really depends on the metrics used by our membership. But we're in store for a real stimulating and provocative evening, I think, this evening. I'm really looking forward to it. So much of the way that China is presented to the world today is what I call monochrome. And everything that China does recently seems to be viewed in a very negative way. But China is, of course, much more complex than that. And the relationship between China and the United States is more consequential than any other relationship on this planet now. So I think it's so important for all of you viewing to have a more nuanced impression and idea and understanding of the kinds of things that are happening in China now. And it's just a delight to be able to collaborate this evening with Beijing University Alumni Association here in Greater New York. It's so important for us. I think nobody understands more deeply than the Alumni Association and its members the importance of the way that America thinks about China, accesses it, and understands it. And that's what we're all about. So it's a pleasure and delight and an honor to collaborate with the association this evening. I just wanted to say a big welcome. And let me just say one more word about China Institute. With everything that's swirling around us, we're forging forward. While COVID is happening and we're temporarily closed and we're doing programs like this, which actually enable us to reach out to more people, construction is underway at our 50,000 square foot headquarters in New York. We're putting finishing touches on an ECNU, East China Normal University Center. We are finishing up plans and designs for our culinary center, which has been funded, and also for space for more classrooms and programs. So hopefully in the near future, we'll be able to welcome you in person. So without further ado, let me hand this over to Emma Yu, who's the recently appointed president of Beijing University Alumni Association here in Greater New York. Over to you, Emma.
Thank you, James and China Institute. Hello, everyone. My name is Emma Yu, president of Peking University Alumni Association of Greater New York. We are graduates from Peking University, which is the top university in China. We are mostly first-generation immigrants who made America our new home. And contributing to our local communities with constant thirst for new knowledge. We are thrilled to be in this partnership with China Institute to co-present a series of great events to local audience. And one of the speakers tonight, Wenyan Yang, is also a Peking University alumni. I hope you all enjoy tonight's discussion on Voices from the Frontline, China's War on Poverty. Thank you. Over to you, Dinda.
Thank you so much. Emma, it's a real thrill to be partnering with Peking University Alumni Association. Thank you so much for that. And I'm Dinda Elliott. I'm the Director of Programs at China Institute. And wow, we have an incredible lineup of speakers tonight. So you are all in for a treat. I'm going to start with Robert Lawrence Kuhn, who is the host and writer of this amazing film that I hope you have all watched, Voices from the Frontlines, China's War on Poverty. And he's also a longtime China-based journalist and advisor to the Chinese government. Robert was awarded the China Reform Friendship Medal by President Xi Jinping and the Chinese Government Friendship Award. For 30 years, Dr. Kuhn has worked with China's leaders and advised the Chinese government. So he really knows what he's talking about. And I assume through those wonderful connections was able to get the amazing access that this film afforded us all as viewers. So we also have Peter Getzels, who is an Emmy award-winning producer, director, and cinematographer, who was the producer and director of the film that I hope you've all watched. He is currently co-creator of the science and philosophy series, Closer to Truth, now in its 20th season on PBS. Peter has worked in China on many projects, including as director and producer of China's Challenges with Robert Lawrence Kuhn, which won an Emmy. Qin Gao, Professor Qin Gao, is a professor at the Columbia University School of Social Work and the founding director of the Columbia China Center for Social Policy. Dr. Gao studies poverty, inequality, social policy, migration, and child development in China and their international comparisons. And she is probably the world's leading expert on China's DBAO system, the minimum income program, which I'm sure she'll tell you about later tonight. We also have Wenyan Yang, who is the Chief of Global Dialogue on Social Development branch in the Division for Inclusive Social Development of UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs. Wenyan coordinates the division's support for the UN Commission for Social Development, and she supervises the preparation of the department flagship publication, World Social Report. So she's a real expert on international development and also a graduate of Peking University. So we're glad to have you with us tonight. Thank you. Finally, our moderator tonight is just as much of an expert as all of the speakers, and that's a real thrill. So I hope, Tiff, that you will actually join in the conversation as well as asking the questions. Dexter, who's known as Tiff Roberts, is an award-winning former China correspondent and author of a wonderful book called The Myth of Chinese Capitalism, The Worker, the Factory, and the Future of the World, which just came out this past year. And Tiff is also a fellow at the University of Montana's Maureen and Mike Mansfield Center and teaches classes there about China. And I can see the book jacket right behind him of his fantastic book. So you should all go out and buy it. But anyway, we're thrilled to have all of you. I'm going to hand it over now to Tiff. Thanks a million.
Okay, well, what a great introduction and what a great group of panelists here. I'd like to start just by jumping right into the movie and hearing from both Lawrence and Peter about that experience. I believe, Peter, you followed, I think it's 5 people's stories of and experiences in the war against poverty. I'm wondering what, I guess first of all, how much time did you spend on the movie and how much time were you out reporting? It looks like quite obviously a lot of effort and time apparently was put into it.
Yeah, the period of time was several years. We were several months in the field. It was an iterative process. We had great teams working from the US and China, all working together. Peter did a great job in this coordination. You know, many stories can be told about China, but poverty alleviation needs to be among them. And that's why it's great. We appreciate the China Institute and Peking University, Greater Association of New York for hosting. And Tiff, it's good to see you again, and congratulations on the book. And we look forward to a very stimulating conversation. Great,
well, thank you. Well, I'd like to start by asking about what was most, you know, you spent a lot of time in China, I know, Lawrence, but what in this during the course of this movie did you find most memorable, and also what was most challenging, thinking back over all those years? I'd like to hear the same from you in a moment as well, Peter.
Sure. Look, I have been working in China since the late 1980s, and you know, I, like you, have written books and I've talked to zillions of people. And the truth is that I learned during the poverty alleviation experience some things that were actually surprising to me. And I thought I couldn't be surprised about anything about China anymore. But for example, that every poor family in China, and at times there were tens of millions, maybe 50 million altogether collectively, families, each one of them had a customized, targeted plan to bring them out of poverty, in which it was not just targeted, it was monitored on a monthly basis. So if you went into a rural, remote mountain village, each family would have a book, and you could see it. And every month, the cadre in charge, generally a young party member who was assigned there, would have to fill it out. How are they doing on their plan? Where are they? And then this was all collated and sent to Beijing for collective analysis. But that detail, where every family was followed, was remarkable. And the second thing is that that individual party member, generally young man in his late 20s, early 30s, who would have been a mid-level or young growth-oriented career-oriented government functionary in a provincial or municipal government, was assigned to that village to be sure that he could take 100 or 150 families out of poverty. And he was assigned to do that often for 2 years. That's 2 whole years where he could only visit his family weekends or even once or twice a month. So it's that level of commitment that is really remarkable. Now, all political systems have challenges, of course, but what we see in poverty alleviation is we use big numbers like 850 million people brought out of poverty, but that doesn't really tell the story. The story is the first 650, 700 million of those people were brought out of poverty over the reform and opening up period just because China was having economic development. You didn't have to focus on poverty because the rising tide of the economic development lifted all boats, so people were brought out of poverty. But around 2012, 2013, when President Xi became senior leader, the realization hit that no matter how much China would continue to grow, no matter how much the GDP per capita would continue to increase, there would still be order of magnitude about 100 million Chinese people who would never get out of poverty, no matter how strong the economics would be. So that was a radical change. And so that initiated what's called the targeted or precision poverty alleviation campaign. And that's what we've seen focused on over these last 9 years or so. And that's what we focused on in our film.
Yeah, you can see in the part when you're visiting the State Council Poverty Alleviation Office in Beijing, that rather amazing map where they have they're actually tracking individual households across the country. I did interviews in the Poverty Alleviation Office there years ago, and believe me, it didn't look like that a decade ago. Peter, what would you? I don't know how you may have. I know you haven't spent as much time as Robert in China, but I'm sure you've spent some time there, some good time there. And I'm just interested in what you found, particularly with this movie, as most illuminating and also challenging as a filmmaker, working across all these different provinces.
Yeah, no, I think that the process of making the film was really an extraordinary experience. I mean, the goal really was to try and get underneath the surface. And the way we could do that was by working in coordination with the team from CGTN. I had 2 Chinese directors I worked with, Fan Lu and Chao Yu, and a really good team of executives all working together, Chen Ying. And the process was really extraordinary insofar as we didn't want it to be a sort of journalistic expose. Our goal was really to try and let people speak for themselves. We didn't want to create a polemic. We wanted to create a sort of experiential or a sort of visceral response to what was going on. So we followed people, as we called it, on the front lines. And in order to do that, we had to spend a lot of time in the field. We had an extraordinary cinematographer, as you can see from the film, Ningnang, who had this great sensitivity about how to approach these families. We really spent time sitting in people's houses in their front rooms, talking to them, just relaxing with the camera, which was part of what we called an observational or verite approach. And that allowed us to really understand some of the nuance about what was going on really from the ground up. And in that way, we were, I think, able to express, especially for an international audience, we're able to express more about what was going on in China vis-a-vis poverty alleviation than what the headlines would be. We made a very strong decision not to have expert interviews, which is maybe a bit anathema to some of the more Chinese documentary approaches, but worked very well internationally. We didn't want to be the experts per se. We wanted to let the experience grow. Robert goes on a journey. He seeks conversations with people. We spend time with families at all different levels of the poverty alleviation process. To me, getting inside the sort of fabric of rural China was a really extraordinary experience. The family that lived in the cave, whose daughter had gone off to college, was a very moving experience for us. Whole families being moved out of the mountains down from very remote mountains. I mean, we're talking about people who haven't been to China. I mean, these are really remote locations. Populations being moved down to smaller cities in order to be able to participate in some of the national uplift. But again, to get inside that, we had to spend time. We had to be patient. We had to just work quietly, really sort of facilitating or eliciting people's moments in which they were just open about what was going on. You saw the conversation in the living room of one of the families that had moved. That was a very natural experience, and that really was our goal. And again, working together cooperatively, I think was really key in order to be able to make this.
Mm-hmm. So as a longtime reporter myself in China, I found that often you really had to make an extra effort to find out what's happening on the ground. And particularly when you're covering a policy that is a national one, as the movie says, a signature policy of the very top leaders, and the very top leader indeed. So I'm curious about sort of the logistics of that, Lawrence. I noted, I thought it was quite impressive what the young students from Southwestern University, their tactic in order to get the real story was to basically not alert the authorities in advance before, I mean, right up until the moment they arrived in a village. And we see that in the movie. I'm just wondering, for you, to what degree were you able to to choose your own interview subjects and choose which places you would go? Because this is always a real issue in China. And again, what steps did you take to try to ensure that you did get that real picture of what was happening on the ground?
To give a full understanding of how we brought this about, really, it's the product of more than three decades of working in China, as you have, in terms of all different kinds of subjects, and winning a kind of trust that not that you will say what the government says or what the party says, but what that you will say is your best sense of what's really happening, and do it in a way that is rooting for China's success. Because one of the worst ways to help somebody is to tell them they're always right or to always agree. But if you're really interested in the long-term success of China, which I certainly am, then it's building that credibility over time that you can be trusted. Not that they would agree with everything. In fact, of course, they don't. And in my case, it goes back to the late 1980s and reflects a lot of my personal relationship with my long-term partner, Adam Ju, who I met on my very first trip to China. And he and I worked together on all sorts of projects, from the biography of former President Jiang Zemin to some very sensitive subjects, to activities last year with the 70th anniversary of the People's Republic. And in that process, he and I worked together, and Adam played a large role in making senior officials working outside the system realize that giving us more access rather than less would facilitate a very genuine looking film. China's done a lot of different kinds of films, and frankly, to a Western eye, when it is propaganda, it is blazingly obvious. And so to give us the trust and to give us the capacity to look at all stories, and Peter can describe the process. I mean, they would, the China team working under Peter would suggest lots of stories. Peter would review each one, and the decision in terms of stories, Peter was in charge of. So it's not that we created all these stories. We gave ideas, and then we got suggestions, and then they talked about it, which fit, which didn't. You followed some leads and some others. It's not a totally scientific process, but it's a process that is organic.
Let me just add one thing about that, which was important. Again, working internationally, there was a way to, harken back to what Robert was saying. Our editor, Kathy Shields, didn't know much about China, but she could react to the material and the stories. And she was a very, very sensitive editor, spent a lot of time looking at the stories, looking at the transcripts, and trying to pull out what kind of resonated for her. And I think that was important because she didn't come at it with an underpinning and ideological position. She came at it what were the strongest stories, who were the strongest characters. And that, in a sense, guided us. And I think that was one of the virtues of having an international team, because, we would bring that kind of international distance to stories that had some kind of intrinsic sort of bottom-up resonance. And that was really, part, I think, of the strength of the film, was that it was an international co-production. Everyone brought their skill, strength, their vision to being able to create this documentary, which I think, tells a very important story that makes sense to a lot of people who might not even be that interested in China. And I think that was very important because they're interested in people. People like people. And I think that was part of the goal, is to engender that experience.
Mm. Yeah, I think it's very successful, certainly in telling that larger policy and development story through real individuals. And we did see not everyone's happy. Some people are happy and some aren't, which was, I think was a good thing to show the full picture. I'd like to turn to Qin Gao. As Dinda said, Qin Gao is probably one of the foremost experts in the world on poverty in China. And of course, you are also in particular probably the world's expert on the DBAO, or the guaranteed minimum income, which I've read many of your papers on that. Delighted to have the chance to hear from you today. I'm interested in what you see. What would be your overall appraisal of the progress in the war against poverty in China? And I'm specifically interested in how the DBAO, what role it has played, if it has played a role in helping to alleviate poverty across China.
Thank you for the question and for this great opportunity to join the discussion. The war on poverty in China has made great progress, as the film showed. So since 2013, the top leadership issued a lot of speeches and guidelines. They quickly were translated into policies. So we have I have sorted through all the policies that have been issued related to poverty eradication, and that's a lot within a very short time. And those policies and directives translated into money. Lots of money poured into the poverty eradication. And at the beginning, it was more central government investment. Gradually, it's shifted a lot to the local governments, who are usually paired up with the impoverished provinces and villages. So a lot of local money, including technology and personnel, which was mentioned earlier, were invested into this campaign. So a lot of progress, a lot of achievements, no doubt. There are also problems and challenges, some of which were shown in the film, right? Whether people are moving voluntarily, whether the approaches used are sustainable, those are some challenges. DBAO as a social assistance program has been existing since 1993, which initiated in Shanghai, and then nationwide in urban areas 1999 and rural areas 2007. So it's been a big program. It's been expanding, although in recent years, since the poverty eradication, DBAO has been declining a bit in terms of population coverage and also investment in funds. I think going forward, the DBAO will have to play a bigger role after 2020. In fact, the central government has just issued a draft social assistance law that I expect to be passed soon, hopefully, so that social assistance centered around DBAO will be established by law as an institutionalized system that will be lasting forever, and that will support the people who are in low income, regardless of the reason, so that they will have this last resort to rely on. So I hope that will be a positive development going forward.
Yeah, one of the things that I would hear from rural Chinese, particularly I spent a lot of time in Guizhou, about the DBAO was just the fact that there was so much variance in the amount. And so in some cases, it was substantial and it meant a lot. In other cases, it was just too small, is what I heard again and again. Have there been efforts? It sounds as if with the emphasis on the war on poverty, there's been a sort of a de-emphasizing of DBAO, but has there been an effort as well to bring it to a more standard level and raise it where it has been very low?
They have been moving in that direction, although it's not being realized. So in any locality, the urban and rural DBAO lines are different. So the rural DBAO lines are lower, and across different regions, they also vary. I think 2-3 years ago, they have connected DBAO with the poverty eradication, so that if you qualify for one, you also qualify for the other. So the two lines merge. There's also been discussion about urban-rural DBAO unification, so that the two lines are not so drastically different. But those are still being adjusted. They are not finalized. So I can understand people complain about the dibao line being too low. And another challenge in rural China, such as the rural areas in Guizhou, is rural income is so hard to measure or gauge, right? They fluctuate so much, so that dibao benefit doesn't accurately or timely reflect people's needs. That's another challenge, especially in rural dibao.
Speaking of fluctuations in rural incomes, I'd like to ask, probably this is best for you, Qin, and also for Peter, what the impact, it's perhaps early days on this, but I'm interested in what the impact COVID has had on poverty alleviation in China. I've spent a bit of time looking at its impact in urban environments. And so far, unfortunately, even as we've seen economic growth return to the cities in China, it's had a real unequal effect. And the upshot of it is it's benefited higher income people much more than lower income people. And you can see that, for example, if you look at migrant worker wages, where in the first quarter there was actually a drop, I think 7 or 8% drop in their average income growth. Whereas again, well-off people were doing better. The other thing I've noticed is there's been a push to, you'll see at the local level, in many cases, the governments have instructed companies that they actually can delay the social welfare payments that they're supposed to put away for the workers' futures. And that's in response to a real legitimate reason, the fact that these companies might be struggling themselves. But this is not good long-term, I think it's fair to say, for their employees if they are not getting what the social welfare program promised them. So I'm interested in, have we seen any impact on poverty alleviation or not? My understanding is it looks like they're still going to achieve their goal of eradicating absolute poverty by the end of this year. But has there been an impact on the larger poverty alleviation goals?
President Xi Jinping made it very clear that irrespective of COVID-19, that China will reach the goal. Before he said that, I think it was in March, a lot of people were saying that the goal of poverty alleviation by the end of this year, eradicating all extreme poverty, that's not total poverty, could be relaxed because of COVID-19. But he put the marker down and said it can't be, which caused a lot of scrambling and perhaps the opportunity for fudging of data here and there because of the pressures. But one of the things that's really important, we're talking about the humanitarian aspect of poverty alleviation in China. Certainly China's contributing, 70% of the whole world's UN 2030 sustainable development, a remarkable contribution. But there is a bigger picture here as well, and it directly relates to COVID-19 because China has been remarkably successful, irrespective of all the politics and all the conspiracy theories and rumors back and forth and that we've all heard, that China has done a remarkable job of containing the Corona-19. And it's not so much that we judge what they say, but what they do. And so when you see in Wuhan, thousands of people getting together on a water festival, you know that really is contained there. And so the question is, how have they been able to do that? Because a lot of people in the West are suspicious. But the fact is, that's why our poverty alleviation documentary is really so directly relevant to this bigger picture, because it provides a window on the Chinese system. Now, as I've said, all political systems have trade-offs. But to look at the Chinese system objectively, you can see a remarkable parallel between how they've attacked the war on poverty with their war on containing the coronavirus. The parallels are enormously similar. It starts with commitment of the top leader, and mobilization of the party, mobilization of the resources to where in the society that they have, they're able to do that. And one of the ways, for example, that we show in the film is 5 layers of local government. So the overall policy is set by the national government, and then 5 layers of local government are implemented. So at the provincial level, municipal level, county level, township, and village, and symbolized in each case by the party secretary, since the party takes the lead. So we show in the film how the 5 layers work on a particular project And we see each of those levels, what they do and how they work together. And this is over periods of years. With COVID-19, it was done over a period of literally weeks where the whole country was mobilized to do that. So the film then becomes this window, not a total picture, but it's a window on an aspect of how the Chinese system works that everybody outside of China should be more aware of.
Yeah, I think just to add a little bit, I mean, I think that was one of the more significant realizations, was this incredible integration, and trying to represent that in film. That was complicated because, you know, it's a large bureaucratic system, but that left a real impression. That level of integration from the top down all the way to the cadres out there in the field who were working with families, 2 or 3 families at a time, sitting with them evening after evening, trying to help develop their ability to lift themselves out of poverty, and with some of the social welfare systems as well. So I think that what Robert said was really resonant about getting a grip on how the Chinese system has been, you know, effective in this regard.
You know, I'd also like to add that there were, as Professor Gao said, there were challenges, there are problems. We need to address that too. For example, with the huge amount of funds involved, there's been corruption. And in 2015, I was impressed that the Chinese government, that there was something like, I don't know, 150,000 cases of corruption during the year that were announced, and some 43,000 were from the anti-poverty campaign. So 43,000 cases of corruption from anti-poverty. And then what you had mentioned, Tiff, regarding the students, and this is the third-party evaluation, because if you have the party secretary of an area responsible for meeting his goals, and he's the one checking and reporting, well, that's it's a textbook case of conflict of interest. So how does China deal with that without an independent media, without the checks and balances that we have in our social system? Well, they have this third-party monitoring system. And not only, you mentioned that when the students surprise people, sometimes the students themselves with their leadership don't even know until that morning which village they're going to go to. So there's no chance of people preparing. So even though you don't have the same kind of checks and balances, you have a sophisticated developing system of how you can build in some kinds of checks on corruption, falsification of data, and these have been raised to very high levels, and so people are scared to do that, which builds more credibility in the system.
Can I jump in to?
I was just going to ask you to jump in. I'd love to. We're very lucky, and the audience is very lucky. We have someone like Wenyan with her global perspective on this through your work at the UN. I'd love to hear you put it in a global perspective. Also, are there lessons here for the rest of the world that in watching China's progress on poverty alleviation?
Well, thank you, Tiff. I just want to first address your question about the impact of COVID-19, whether that's going to slow down poverty reduction in China. I think in the past 40 years, China has been the giant engine that could, right? Whether it's economic growth or poverty winning battles against poverty. Of course, COVID-19 is having severe socioeconomic impact in all countries, including China. But I think that the China's success story in battling poverty has at least two important components. I think Robert at the beginning mentioned that the economic growth, that's the rising tide that lifts all the boats. And so COVID-19 is probably going to have a dampening effect on economic growth. So on that side, we probably see less kind of power in that sense to reduce poverty in the lifting all boats sense. But of course, we know not all boats are equal. Some boats have cracks. Some boats are leaky. So when the tide rise and some boats are not being lifted, right? So that this film actually is talking about the more targeted programs to assist people living in remote areas or from very poor background, with very low levels of education and all that. So those are the way I see it, are the measures that's helping people to fix the boat so that when the tides rise, they would ride with the tide. So that in that area, I think that Chinese government is extremely committed to carry out the poverty eradication program. And I think if one thing we have witnessed in the past 40 years, the Chinese government is capable of, is once they make a commitment, they have not only the political will, but also the implementation capacity. That is the thousands of cadres that we saw in the film that working at the village level, and that's also at the the Beijing office that's monitoring and assisting local governments. So I think that this commitment to help people who are being left behind by the rising economic tides is definitely there. So I don't think that COVID-19 is going to have a severe impact on that front. So what's the combined effect? I think we have to see. So, and as I mentioned that in the past 40 years, China has been the big engine that could in the global fight against poverty. So I just to prepare for my intervention, I kind of collected a few numbers. Well, first of all, now I kind of put the camera lens back a little bit, to put China's fight against poverty in an international context. And Peter, Tiff, your question directly to me. So the first of all, eradication of poverty is the central goal of development agenda. It was goal number 1 among the 8 Millennium Development Goals adopted at the UN in the year 2000. Specifically, this goal was going to cut the percentage of people globally living in poverty from the 1990 level by half by the year 2015. And now we have passed the year 2015. This goal of eradication of poverty remains the number 1 goal of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that were adopted in the UN in the year 2015. So of course, the natural question is, how are we doing on this? First, China overachieved the goal by a very long shot. I found World Bank data that using the international poverty line of $1.90 a day per person, China had over 60% of China's population living under this global international poverty line in the year 1990. By the year 2015, there's less than 1% of China's population below this poverty line. In terms of absolute numbers, suffice to say that China and the region of Asia globally are the place where over this same period of time, the absolute number of people living below this international poverty line continuously declined. In contrast, in other regions of the world, Latin America, Africa, Central Asia, even in developed, industrialized, rich countries, the number of people who are living under poverty line had gone up some years and went down in some other years. So, but China consistently managed to reduce the number of people living in poverty. So, and that's why I said China has been the big engine that could. Through this international comparative lens, we can see that the accomplishment of China in the poverty battle not only improved the lives of hundreds of millions of people, as Robert mentioned, 850 million people out of poverty, it also helped the world to meet the number 1 goal of development. So this contribution, I think, China makes to global development is also worthwhile pointing out. I will stop here.
Thank you. Very good to get that global perspective. I think we're actually getting close to the portion of today when we'd like to allow the audience to ask questions, but I'd like to quickly just maybe make two observations. One, I think without question, the most controversial part of the war on poverty is relocation. And there are numerous instances of both corruption related to relocation projects and very unhappy people in relocation as well. I'd like to note as well that the movie makes the point that no other country in the world has used relocation anywhere on the scale of China. And I've actually spent quite a bit of time talking to unhappy relocated people in China. So I guess maybe this will come up in our audience portion, but I'm interested, why such an emphasis on relocation if it is as controversial a policy as it is? And then just one other thing quickly, my book, The Myth of Chinese Capitalism, looks a lot at the role of the household registration system, or the hukou, and how it actually holds back the development of large numbers of people. The movie ends with a young man saying, very movingly, "I want to leave these mountains and go to school in the cities." And I just couldn't help thinking about the fact that for vast numbers of rural children, including many in poverty or poor, that's simply not an option because of the household registration policy. So those are two things I struggle with when I look at China's war on poverty, both relocation and the fact it does not seem to integrate any meaningful household registration reform. But I think, as I said, we do want to make sure we have plenty of time for the audience here. So I think maybe I should just leave it at that, and perhaps it'll come up more in the audience question portion. I understand from our session beforehand that questions should be raised through the raise hand function at the bottom of the screen, and we have something like 300 participants, so I'm sure there's a lot of eager people that would like to ask questions. I'd hand it over to them now.
Okay, I see a question from Dinda Elliott. Dinda, you're on. Please unmute yourself. Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for letting me ask a question. So first, thank you all for this really fascinating conversation. I do want to jump on that question about relocation. I would really love to hear from both Gao Qin and Wenyan what you guys think about, is it okay to do that? And I know you have kind of personal experiences from your family and growing up, and I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about that. Thanks so much.
Wenyan, you go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm unmuted. Yes, in that film, I think in reality as well is one of the controversial programs. I would say that from my personal experience, I have mixed feelings about it. You see, from a personal background, I grew up in a mountain area in China, in the rural areas. And when I was growing up, I really didn't really want to stay there for the rest of my life. So moving to a bigger town or a city would be very desirable. Then, of course, I have aged, and I had more experience, and also I'm trained as an economist. I think that it's not a simple black and white issue that, yes, it's good, no, it's bad, yes, it should be done, no, it shouldn't be done. I think that we have to acknowledge why mostly young people want to move out of rural areas, remote areas, into urban, or even sometimes just a bigger town. Why? Because of opportunities for education, for jobs. So we have to acknowledge that. But at the same time, of course, that there are people, for whatever reason, they don't want to move. And then, or even for the young people who want to move, after they move, there has to be support. See, if they go there without jobs and without access to educational opportunities, it wouldn't work. it would just cause frustration and social tension. So I think that, you know, I'm sorry, but I really wouldn't answer it with a yes or no. I would just say that that it has to be, the context is very important, and then maybe there's a generational kind of gap in terms of whether people want to move or not. But I think that from a social policy perspective, we need to think about the support policies to support people who move, as well as people who don't want to move. So what the older people who are left behind in the villages, you can't just leave them to, you know, to live out the rest of their life unassisted or separated from their family, the younger members of their family. So I think it's a much more nuanced issue.
Very interesting. Thank you very much. There was, of course, in the movie, there's the young man who says he doesn't like the relocation because he doesn't have a job. So obviously that is so relevant.
I went to college, I got a good job, so that for me, it worked out very well.
There's a social disturbance as well, because in the remote areas, although the standard of living by our standards is not high, there's a certain social relationship. So the male of the family is the breadwinner, and he does the farming or the animal husbandry, and the woman has their role. When they're moved to the city, they may have a 3-bedroom apartment with flush toilets, but suddenly the man now needs to find a job at something he never done before. The women sometimes are more able to get a certain kind of job. So we found this, you could see this social disturbance, which actually could have long-term impact on the individuals. But clearly from the standpoint of the children, and in talking to Chinese leaders, they always say that we're thinking about the next generation, recognize, although they don't talk publicly so much about it, that there will be disturbances in the current generation. But in order to give everybody equal opportunities in the next generation, this is part of the process. So relocation is a critical part of the overall scheme. It's not the only one. I mean, China talks literally about 5 kinds of approaches to targeted poverty alleviation, creating micro businesses, education, relocation is the third, what they call eco-compensation, which is for ecologically protected areas. People will be paid not to disturb the environment, but to build ecological friendly industry like tourism. And then finally, social security, where people who are infirm or can't work have a certain kind of payments. So they have these 5 relocations, not the only one, but it's one of the 5, and indeed it is the most controversial.
Qin, I'd love to hear from you as well with your own personal experience being from China, perhaps sharing some of the experience of
Thank you. I completely agree with what Wenyan shared in terms of the social support that's needed after the relocation. There I see an important role to be played by social workers, the young students I'm working with colleagues to train. I also want to remind us that when people relocate, usually to cities, they are moving into a cash society, which they are not entirely used to. So they need the cash flow, right? In a rural area, they can rely on food produced from their farmland and other sources. But in an urban society, they need a lot of cash support. I want to come back to Tiff, your point about hukou reform. I reflect upon my life story so far. I think I had 3 great leaps forward. The most recent is coming to the US to pursue my PhD. The one before that is going to Beijing to study in college. But the first one, without me doing anything, was when I was 6 years old. My family moved from a village to a xiancheng, a county city, a small city, but we also obtained urban hukou. So that really changed my life. I think back, I think I had half a year of first grade in the village. There were 2 classrooms with all 5 grades, first grade, third grade, 5th grade in one classroom, the other 2 grades in the other classroom, 1 teacher. If I were still there, I wouldn't have today's opportunities. And my cousins who stayed in the village didn't have my life opportunities, and their kids don't have my kids' life opportunities. So those are the reflections of the relocation, the hukou reform, what they mean for people's lives. Thank you.
That's fascinating. Yeah.
And the panelists, we got a question from Susan Mays in the chat box. I'm going to read it to you. Other than the devow and the relocation, what other methods are common in anti-poverty programs? I didn't catch what the young officials were doing in terms of helping 150 families each, or was it 2 or 3 families each? How were officials helping families?
The 5 methods I mentioned are the kind of the big categories that people use. Just to drill down on one, creating micro businesses. So we witnessed, for example, micro funding to build mushroom huts. So these long barracks buildings that are growing mushrooms that people do, and then they can sell those. So part of the responsibility of the local cadre is to figure out for each family which of the various things they need and to come up with plans. You know, it's a complex job that they have, because if you look at the individual level, we're talking, you know, the level of 30,000 feet, but individuals have this tension of not wanting to be poor and to be recognized as not poor. On the other hand, if they are poor, they get subsidies. So they have this tension. The cadre has a tension to get his numbers up high, but on the other hand, he has to be sure that there's no fraud. And so we saw one example of a local cadre who suspected that a family was hiding income. And so he came up with a plan to send the husband out of the room on a kind of a false assignment, so he could kind of question the wife, and then did it reverse so that he could compare to see if they were indeed hiding income. So when you dig down in terms of how the system works, it's really, really fascinating when you see this interaction. But the bottom line is that the local cadre is responsible for each family to come up with a specific plan. Oftentimes it has to do with a micro industry. Sometimes it's an individual. Sometimes it's a collective of a number of people working together to create and sell fruit. But that's the core, because other things are not as sustainable. Only when you build income is it really sustainable over time. We saw many examples where it was not sustainable. It's the type of thing that would be 2 or 3 years, and it's sort of a kind of a pyramid type of system, because people are trying to make their numbers. So it's not a simple story. The overall motivation is very good, but the implementation is very much varied.
Let me just add a piece. You know, one of the first cadre that we featured in the film in Hainan, he was a very sensitive young man, and he worked very personally. He had maybe 5 or 6 families that he was working with. And he had a role not only as sort of economic advisor, but he was also sort of a psychologist. And he was one farmer who had been drinking a lot, and he worked with this farmer for a long time to try and get him to stop drinking and to try and raise his herd of goats. I mean, so he really cared about the people he was working with, but his role was variegated. He left his family for 2 years. He had young kids. He would talk to them on his cell phone and whatnot. And he really would sit down and really try and help people figure out what they needed in their life. And he was a very impressive young man. And after one of his first years ended, he said he'd sign up for another year because he really cared about the families he had been working with. And again, his role was variegated. Now, he was a government official, but he's a young guy at the real grassroots level. And I saw him sitting with this farmer trying to tell him, it's good you're not drinking, and being supportive and all that. I was impressed by how genuine he seemed about what he was trying to do. It was very person to person.
We have another question from an anonymous attendee. Is there any U.S. government entity or official assigned to learning from China lessons in alleviate poverty?
I'm not sure that's within the expertise of the panel, but if it is, please.
This government? I don't think so.
I was going to say, especially now, probably if there was one before, probably the person had been moved somewhere else.
Or is hiding.
Yes, or hiding, yes.
Okay, now we have got a question from Ruth Jin. Ruth, you're on. Can you unmute yourself?
Okay, thank you so much, all the panelists. Apparently, United States have a very high poverty rate, and in China, I mean, there's a minimum wage regulations. There is a minimum wage requirement, and China has very much focused on education. No matter where you live, they have a very high quality education without having to spend a lot of money for families. And I was wondering whether the panelists can opine on what the United States can learn from China in terms of education, the federal government's policy on educational programs.
I would like to just quickly point out, because I've spent a lot of time looking at education in China, and it's far from equal. And there's very, very impressive education, particularly in the showcase cities, places like Shanghai, and there's very, very poor education in rural China. A scholar who's spent a lot of time looking at this is Scott Rozelle at Stanford University. And there's been tremendous progress, but China's education system is defined by inequality to a large degree today. So I push back a little bit against that, but let me hand that over to the panelists.
Certainly from my conversation with officials in China, the idea of a teleeducation and using the internet to get equality between children in rural areas and urban areas is a high priority. I've heard this now for many years, perhaps more difficult to implement than people would think, but nonetheless, this is high on their agenda. It's the quickest way to bring equality to China, which is a major problem. We used to say until COVID-19 that inequality was China's greatest problem. And how do you do that? It will take multiple generations to bring equality, the so-called rural vitalization program, where rural areas would have the same level of standard of living as urban areas, is a great goal, and progress being made, but it's still decades, if not generations away. But to use teleeducation to bring equality more quickly to kindergarten and to primary school is a much more objective and much more rapid way to bring ultimate equality.
We have two more questions. Here is the first one. This is from Sarah Williams. Is this film going to get, or did it get, wider distribution so more Americans can learn about poverty alleviation in China?
We have had broadcasts on PBS SoCal and Southern California, a number of other stations, but frankly, there has been some, shall we say, controversy about the film. People can look it up on the internet in terms of what some sectors of American society thought about PBS's role in dealing with elements of the Chinese government. Some people didn't look upon that too favorably. So the film has had some controversy. It's still in process. We believe, Peter and I and the whole team, irrespective of our organizational or national affiliations, believe that this film is an important film for more and more people to see, both in the United States, elsewhere in the world, including in China. So we're apolitical, but we are very partisan in promoting this film as representing part of the China story. It's not the whole China story. There are a lot of other things that can be said about China, both complementary and critical, but we believe this film is an important part of the dialogue in the global marketplace of ideas about China. And so that's why all of us on the team, Adam Zhu, the executive producer, Peter, myself, I mean, we are all a missionary in trying to get this film as widely distributed as possible, and to engage everyone from all different points of view in its discussions. If people want to criticize various things or ask about censorship or what we left out or why didn't we cover this or cover that, I am all for dealing with those questions. The more open and the more honest we are in presenting stories about China, good and bad, the better off for everyone.
one last question from Alicia Tan. Can the panelists please comment on the household registration system's role in perpetuating poverty and urban or rural inequalities?
Can I try to kind of just throw, in Chinese we say 抛砖引玉, right? So I will throw a break here. I think that the hukou system is one of those actually historical artifacts in China. It's not the Communist Party that started hukou system. Historically, there has been something. I mean, different versions, but hukou registration is one of the historical heritages in China. Having said that, I think that certainly the hukou system restrict free mobility of people, from rural to urban, free migration. So that in that sense, it could probably in fact contributed to intergenerational transmission of poverty if you are confined to the rural environment where access to education, employment are limited. At the same time, I have to say that the hukou system also serves some positive purposes, such as why in China, the urban, we don't see this phenomenon of urban slums. Why in China, that we don't have millions of people living in conditions that we just really, we can't imagine. Because hukou serve that purpose of kind of managing the flow, so to control population movements and all that. So I think it's one of the things that historically is served some purpose. Having said that, I think that now you see in China, hukou is officially still there, but the economic opportunities and employment, the labor market is opening up to the effect that hukou is no longer a strict limitation on mobility within the country. So I think that the effect of perpetuating poverty among generations is definitely reduced with the current economic structure and economic system in China.
Wenyan, I would just like to point out that indeed there is labor mobility, although it is affected by the hukou. It very much affects where young people live, and the liushou artong, the phenomena of children growing up apart from their parents, has everything to do with the hukou, as does the Kongchaocun, the empty nest villages. So I push back a little bit against the idea that it doesn't have an economic impact. I think certainly through education and the fact that children are growing up separate from their parents, it does have an impact. But I should let the panelists, the rest of the panelists.
You are right. It's not. I'm not saying that it doesn't have the impact. I said it's reduced. Compared to when I was growing up in China.
All economists I speak to in China say that eventually the hukou system should be eliminated. The question is how and how to do it efficiently. You did it all at once, it would so burden most cities that they would collapse. So it's not a simple process.
Mm-hmm.
They've been talking about it since the 2013 third plenum. So they are moving very slowly, but I agree, it's complicated. I'm sorry, Qin, you were about to speak.
Just to add one data point, in 2018, on average, urban families had about 20% of their income from social benefits. That includes pensions, health insurance, social assistance, etc. For rural families, that is 10%, which has increased a lot since 2002. That used to be 2-3%. So the gap is narrowing, but the gap is still big.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to jump in if I may. I'm coming back. This is Dinda again. And unfortunately, our time is up. This has been the most fascinating conversation. And I think I want to especially thank all of you for the complexity of the conversation, because that's exactly what's missing in the conversation about China here in the States these days, is complexity. You know, you've described a situation where there are good guys and bad guys, just like there are in every country. And, you know, it looks at different values, and the very idea that in China, as Lawrence, as you said, you know, that the government has kind of made a decision that they might be willing to sacrifice this generation of people who are being reallocated for the sake of the next generation. I mean, that's a fascinating, you know, complicated idea, but certainly defensible is something that, you know, we in America don't sort of see things that way, but it's just fascinating. And I just want to thank you for the complexity. Tiff, amazing to have a panelist who is such an expert on the subject matter yourself. Wenyan and Gao, I mean, amazing to have two experts, really literally global experts who actually have experienced China's poverty alleviation, who actually came from poor rural villages. How amazing to have your personal perspective. And Lawrence and Peter, you know, what a film, really, what a feat you have achieved. I agree with you very much. I think it would be really, really great for everyone in America to see this film, because it just kind of puts it out there. This is what it's like. This is both good and bad, and, you know, take it for what you think it is. It's really fantastic. So thank you so much for the complexity. That's exactly what China Institute is all about. We are trying so much to add nuance to the conversations that we have here in the States about China these days. And I want to thank you so much for that refreshing discussion of some very, very complex issues. So thank you. We've all learned a whole lot from you tonight. So thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. And China Institute.
Thank you.